Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another Super Sunday Supplement Live. We are missing the Goliath that is Mr. Ross Harper, but nonetheless, we are here with absolute giants of personality, intellect, and everything else you can think of. That's Mr. Adam Lawrence, Lady Helen Chorley of Malta, and Mr. Piotr Rusnek and myself. We're going to be talking in the same vein that we normally talk about, the same things we normally talk about, but we're going to put our own spin on it. And we're going to be focusing on different elements that we ourselves find interesting with our own views and opinions, which you are more than welcome to join in on, of course. So today we're going to be discussing, is there really a housing crisis? Is the affordability between the north-south divide something which is creating a false equivalency in housing and not? And what is affordability, and how do people measure affordability around the country? Fortunately, we have Adam here who understands the London market, has bought and sold there, is based in the Midlands, but also invests up north. Helen's a northern bird from memory. You hail from not far from Hadrian himself, and Piotr was educated in Scotland, lived in different parts of the UK, but settled in London for his sins. So we're just going to go through and talk. There will be diversions. There will be off the plot. There will be madness. There will be craziness. So you're all welcome to kind of ask questions, join in, agree, disagree. And yeah, I mean, we were running 5 minutes late, and we started getting death threats. Like, where are you? My coffee's getting cold. So
we are streaming to like 3 different locations. So we on my Facebook timeline, on my LinkedIn timeline, and also on the Property Sisters YouTube channel. So a lot of people basically watching this in different forums. But today's topic is a little controversial, huh?
Well, it certainly seems to upset quite a few people whenever you bring it up. It's really interesting because I commented on a couple of pieces, both of which happen to be in The Guardian. I've said before how important I think it is to read across the spectrum, and I know that the Assembled Company agree with that. And The Guardian are I find them a really dichotomous newspaper, really, because you either get a fairly well-researched, especially I'm going by today's journalism standards. I'm not going by, academic professorial standards, but you either get a fairly well-researched, reasonably, with a slight left-wing tinge to it, slight liberal bent on it for sure, but a pretty reasonable piece of journalism, or you get some ideological utter claptrap that is really, really poor. But I commented on a couple of things, and one of them was really interesting because it was blaming the Chinese specifically, and it blamed them by name in the headline for something. It wasn't particularly housing related, or there was a housing slant on it. And I made a comment that said, this is a funny thing, because I would have thought if you'd put this in the Daily Mail or the Daily Express, then we'd be having a long diatribe about how racist it was because it wasn't relevant that they were Chinese in the story. It wasn't relevant to the headline at all. Now, you could, of course, say, well, China is an oppressive country, and go into all sorts of things that are going on with Uyghur Muslims and all the rest of it that are absolutely true and indefensible. Don't get me wrong, but that doesn't enable you to get a pass, in my view, against 1.4 billion people, 1.39999 billion of whom it's not their fault. What's going on in the whole of China, realistically. And the other one was about a recent initiative to increase credit to particular key workers. So you might have seen this. This was around, I'm not sure who the lender is because they didn't name them, and I haven't actually researched it because it's not particularly pertinent to me, but up to 7 times lending for defined key workers. And my comment about China and the Daily Express and the Mail got 3 likes, possibly predictably, because the Guardian audience isn't ready for those slaps around the face every 2 minutes. But my comment on this one was got about 145 likes, quite a lot of engagement, and spurred quite a good discussion. And my comment was, why do we still live in a society where, because the overall tone of the article, I should say, was, oh, more fuel to the fire, up go the housing prices, the housing crisis, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, why are we not saying well done to the lender who's come up with this initiative, because people who've proven themselves to be key workers throughout the pandemic, it'll give them a bit of a help to get onto the housing ladder. Should this not be a good thing? Should we not be celebrating that? They still need the deposit. It's 90% loan to value stuff. And that's where a lot of people were behind me on that one. And then, of course, I got a few, generally left-wing commentators who were trying to take me down a peg or two. You've got to bear in mind my avatar on Facebook is still the National Property Auctions logo. So it does rather pin my colours to the mast somewhat. So I got a few speculators on no prizes for guessing what you do for a living or whatever. Most of which, of course, as usual, assumptions made an ass out of you and me and generally what they said. But there were a few people who came on and supported what I was saying, and we were talking about rents and the upward direction of them, and we were talking about the fact that we have a few problems, don't we? We do have a very, very localized crisis. We have a if you want to define the crisis as in the broadest possible way, not everyone can buy what they want in terms of housing for a price that they can either afford or want to pay. Well, welcome to the market, unfortunately.
I'd like a penthouse in Mayfair, but
I'd like a gold plate. The old, you can have a gold-plated Rolls Royce as long as you pay for it. Is an absolute classic, isn't it? And that's exactly what some of the comments were along the lines of. But then, the reality of it is it's very localized. Yes, there are many problems in London. There are also problems with the housing mix, and that was one of the points that I was making in terms of, the pandemic has changed the required housing mix, because we're a service-based economy, 75% plus. I think 79, 80% of our GDP is produced in the services sector. The services sector, a broad brush, can generally work at least somewhat remotely, or a lot of the employees in the service sector can. Hybrid working is kind of now really probably past the acid tests of being the way forward. And of course, there's everything from the people who've worked from home 1 day a week for 30 years to the people who've been working from a beach for the last 10 years to people who never thought they'd be able to be allowed out the office under the watchful eye of the CCTV or whatever to be allowed to work, which is probably closest to financial services, I'd imagine, apart from what I know. Maybe Helen could comment on that one. But that's sort of where we're at. And what does that really mean? I'm sure we've all had these sorts of Zoom calls over the, I've certainly had to do Zoom calls from various properties, houses, different rooms, the staircase, whatever really works at the time. Because the car, world famous office, the car, but because all these things were going on, and had lots of Zoom calls with people who we were having quite a high level or expensive conversation, i.e. they were charging me quite a lot of money per hour for their services. But actually you could overhear the conversation their partner was having in the background about something completely different. And it was quite hard to tune that out and to concentrate on them, because they didn't have the rooms in their house to accommodate two, or if you've got, more grown-up children, 3-4 people maybe working from home from the same house. So you can sort of add 0.7 bedrooms or whatever onto the requirement of the average nuclear family. And that creates a really interesting situation, because we've known for years, what is there a shortage of genuinely? Great 3-bed properties within a radius of an outstanding school, or a good school, let's say, right? Postcode lottery stuff. Well, if you need 0.7 more bedrooms, you've got more of a problem in that department, because what gets built is out-of-town housing estates with small 3 beds, really, really quite small bedrooms, paper-thin walls, and not necessarily that convenient for location and new schools and all the rest of it. So you go to the, I remember years ago an estate agent saying to me, look, and this is a very suburban comment, don't get me wrong, but it was like, well, look, anything above 3 bedrooms, it's not necessarily what you need, and it's not really what people will pay for. Your core stock is your 3-bed house. Now, if that sort of moves up to the 4-bed, well, there's a dearth of 4 beds generally anyway. And if people genuinely want them, that causes a lot of friction in the marketplace. And it also means that a lot of stuff that people build, because it stacks up as a project on its own, and we've talked about this before, in cities and things like that. If it stacks up as a project on its own, but there's 50 other projects the same going on in the same city at the same time, there may not be, market for. That's 2016 London Zone 1 and Zone 2, 50,000 flats in development did anybody check if anybody wanted 50,000 flats, or they didn't really? So that was a bit of a problem, wasn't it?
Yeah. Prime example where I am in Vauxhall, and just towers and towers and towers of expensive flats, and who's buying them?
Yeah,
so
well,
that's the question. Like, so we talked about this before, like that there is a need of whatever 200,000 flats or 200,000 units every year, and then there's, let's say, 100 or 80,000 built every year. So every year there's additional 100,000 coming on, but the things that are being built, like for example, if 30,000 is being built in London and they're all above 750k, then does this really help with that, with being able to basically use them and for people to live in those flats, right? And
yeah, absolutely. There's also an argument. Rod shared some really interesting figures a while back that were flushed out, if you like, by the pandemic. Just on Airbnb, 87,000 units in London alone came back to the market because there was no short-term let market for that time, or they were listed on Airbnb. So obviously not all of those are empty all of the time, because some of them are second bedrooms and people making the most of their rent a room allowance and all the rest of it. But that's something, you're quite correct, Piotr. I don't know if anybody's got the figures for how far short we've fallen every year, but as I understand it, the deficit or the overdraft now is in the tune of a couple of million. So there is definitely that shortage. Obviously, on the flip side, you could count all the HMOs that, instead of housing one family, house 5+ different people, or 5+ different households, although they don't necessarily house many more people if they're taking family homes out of the equation. So there's sort of an argument either way there in terms of what counts as a hereditament or whatever, which we probably won't get into, although I'm clearly gunning for word of the day. I can see that wry smile on Jay's face there. He can beat hereditament though easily. He's got ages.
Well, I find this interesting. The whole, I think it was 300,000 that they mentioned a couple of years ago, and then people saying, "Oh, but they're not meeting that requirement or that getting that into the catchment." But I was sitting there and thinking, well, there are a number of people that die every year, and a number of people that are born every year, right? And the number of people that die a year actually free up more housing stock than the number of people that are born every year, right? Because it's going to take the person that is born 15, 16 years before, maybe 18 years before they go to university or something like that, in which case they're taking up student accommodation. When they come out of that, they are probably going into an HMO, or they're going into a house share with their uni mates or something like that. It isn't really until you get to the mid-20s-ish, either when they're getting married and having children, or when they're deciding they need their own space, they go to a flat, and there are all these different things that kind of come out from it. So I've always seen, and the HMO market is a bit of a market lubricant to kind of getting people out and in their own kind of space to a certain degree. But there's so much kind of animosity from the local council level and the planning level against not just HMOs, but new build developments, especially when you're looking at new builds in somewhere like London, where you've got the mayor's sill, or there's the additional mayoral kind of payment. Then there's the sill, then there's the 106, then there's the this and the that. And all of a sudden, you can't buy the land or the building cheap enough to do a development big enough to make it financially viable. And that's not talking about...
not as an SME developer anyway. Like the big guys, don't have a problem, do they? But I speak to SME developers every day, and this is the challenge: making the numbers work in a risk weighted kind of a risk managed basis, and proceeding with that in spite of all those costs. Sorry.
This is it, and you can't buy the land and pay for the money and all the rest of it. Whereas, I've had this discussion before with a friend of mine who's a third gen developer, and they've got a significant land bank, and he's accepted that in the past they've developed sites out where they couldn't be, either maybe the sale fell through or they couldn't be bothered with the sale process, but they would have been better off if they sold it rather than the blood, sweat and tears of actually building it out. And the money that they made, which is still significant on the site, is because they bought the land 20 years ago at a great price and had the vision to be able to get the right sort of planning. At that point, the real gain has absolutely stopped, and the actual mechanism of going through. And if you're going to sort of start, incentivizing or disincentivizing more correctly people in that way, don't be surprised when you end up with something horrible. I've got two pretty good examples of that at the moment. I met with the council, although it's a relatively small council. This is up Lincolnshire way, have appointed an officer to help people raise grants for shops on the high street, ideally listed buildings, which is a building that we're working on, but really just to improve the high street. It's not a huge pot of money, but they've got someone experienced who knows how to get funding. Now, that council has, without a shadow of a doubt, we bought a building, it already had planning, the planning was poor, the architecture was appalling, like wouldn't pass building regs. The building hadn't been maximised, that's where the opportunity was. So we've gone from a building with commercial downstairs and 6 flats to one with better and more lettable commercial downstairs and 9 flats without doing any extensions. Right now, there's demand for that. There's no two ways about it. It's a flagship building in the town. The council, and I'm talking about a local town councillor, the associate director of planning, all that whole hierarchy, to a person, have been supportive, because this building's been empty for 5 years and they want something to get sorted. And frankly, they've used their brain and they've been brilliant. And they're supporting an application to restore the shop front, because it's a listed building, to what it used to look like, because it used to be 2 shops before. 100 years ago, it was 2 shops. And we're going to try and restore that facade. And the funding that I'm applying for is going to pay for 90% of that, including the professional fees. So really forward thinking. We'll aid with match funding if we need more than we can get anyway. Couldn't be more supportive. As a counter to that, I'm trying to put a sign outside somewhere, the Genesis Centre in the East Midlands. Right, we've spoken about it before. A nice sign. The current sign's a bit tired, a bit crap, gathers moss on it, and it's just not very nice and not very inviting. I'd like to do some LEDs. I'm not looking for helicopters to be flying over it and laser light shows and Jean-Michel Jarre to be involved and whatever.
Vegas lights.
Yeah, although that would be quite cool. Yeah, obviously. I'm just looking for something sensible and a sensible conversation. And all I get from the council is, well, it's a bit cluttered around there anyway. It can't be that sort of size. It can't. It's just no for a sign. Now, a lot of people will just give up at that point because just think, well, sod you, realistically. And if they're doing that over something like that, then, it has to come down to, there's a culture in certain local authorities, and it tends to be where they're more hands off. And of course, this gets worse in London. It's worse in London than anywhere else. Because of the concentration of the problem. And like Jay says, if you're considering paying for some of the mayor's civil list or whatever it gets called, then it's not what you want to be spending your money on. When you've already got resources, what do you see from wealthy people when they want to give to charities? Do they want to give to somewhere where it's going to go on marketing? Usually not, realistically. They want to go somewhere where it's going to have an impact. And you hear people talk a lot about effective charities and things like that, and we've spoken about that before in other contexts. And it's the same from my perspective, and especially as I've looked at the world in this way a lot of the time. So what do? I love taking buildings that are crap and are unused and are derelict and bringing them back into use. Right, I love that. That gives me a sense of achievement. It gives me a bit of purpose, and I love the feedback at the end when someone says, what a beautiful home you've made it, or whatever. Right now, like I said, I've said before, I'm not asking for awards, medals, knighthoods. I hear a few military titles are going after the week that some people have had, but I'm not looking to be Colonel of the Queen's Fusiliers or whatever. But I enjoy that, and I believe it adds value, and it's not crowding out first-time buyers either. So I can't accept that. I've put hundreds of units back into use that wouldn't have been otherwise used. I can still be absolutely vilified as a villain by the commenters on the Average Guardian thread, and I put myself out to be thus and to quite enjoy the riposte, really. But
well, I think the problem that you suffer, Adam, is that yes, you have done all those things and they're laudable and it's great stuff, but you should have done it as a charity. God, you profited? What an absolute.
Are you saying I should have been more like those housing associations that are not for
Oh yeah, the not-for-profit
Yeah.
housing associations that leave people impoverished in their buildings because of blah 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 and blah.
Would that I got paid what they do, Mr. Howard, on a yearly basis.
Indeed, sir.
Would I do?
You and I both.
Absolutely. So, incentives have got to be at the sort of core of the debate, haven't they? And, crushing SME developers, and that really is effectively what's happened. Crushing SME developers is going to lead to what we've seen over the last 10 years, massive wealth transfer from Help to Buy, poor quality building standards. And, all these things going forward are great in terms of, okay, let's shut down the leasehold situation. Look, I don't like it. It's feudal. It's crap. It's like the word landlord. It doesn't belong in 2022. I totally agree. But let's just follow the conversation through to its natural conclusion, rather than making virtue signaling statements like, yeah, we've got to stop talking to people like that. We've got to stop doing that. Well, as Helen's already said there, if the incentive isn't really there, and then you take some more stuff out of the cake, or you tax it a little bit more, or whatever it turns out to be, you need to be very careful that the margins, you could incentivize certain types of house building, couldn't you? There was one good comment on an article someone shared this week around a European model. I can't remember. I think it applies in several countries. The local authority buys the land, engages with the developers. So similar to what I talked about in the supplement this week around the sort of Finnish and Swedish models, in terms of you raise the taxes, you bring them in, but you get the market to deliver the solution. This should not be a thing we have all this friction with. This is a good idea, right? Find the goods that aren't well provided for. Education is an absolute classic one, market failure, basics of economics, right? And get the market to deliver the solution within a regulatory framework, right? Yeah. And that's what they're doing in housing in some countries in Europe. And you'll have seen the famous examples that get poo-pooed, like the Norwegian social housing where they've got a swimming pool and stuff like that. They've all been shared around the internet, and then everybody just blames how much oil Norway have got, even though the UK pretty much had exactly the same opportunities and completely squandered them. But I mean, let's not bother mentioning that. Piotr's been closest to that one, being in Aberdeen way.
Aberdeen exactly is an example of that, because it had so much oil and prospered really well, and now it's really lost an opportunity to make use out of it, and now there's nothing really in there apart from a sports center, a new library in the university, and that's it basically. So yeah, wasted opportunity.
Tragedy of a great city. Yeah.
I think one of the points that you're making there, Adam, is I think it was either during the first set of COVID lockdowns or maybe just after, at auction, we started seeing some plots of land that were kind of like either had garages on them and things like this. And they were being sold as leaseholds, like 125-year leases, being sold by the local authority with planning already on them for like 3 or 4 houses and stuff like that. And you think, why would I want to develop on leasehold land? Well, here's the kicker. If you did the development within 2 years, they would assign over the freehold to you, because they wanted you to do the development. They wanted you to do the build out. So they had the land, they had the planning, they gave the opportunity. But if you were buying it just to flip it or trade it, you're going to be stuck with a leasehold bit of land. But if you were buying it to do the build out, well, there's your reward. You get the freehold. So they were using it, and I think it was like Middlesex, and it was some. It was Hillingdon. Yeah.
So this was the one point I was making about local authorities and that sort of level of idea. And my take on it really is, and this goes all the way through to MPs, one of the least popular subjects of all time at the moment, probably. But the reality is, if you look at what we pay our MPs versus what other countries pay, is quite poor. And if you boil that down to the local authority level, I mean, it's horrific. That friend of mine who was a councillor years ago, I know he was getting a stipend of £8,000 a year to be a councillor. So you might as well pay nothing. The money's neither here nor there. You're going to get a certain personality type that do that job. Yeah. And it's not a realistic job, for 99.9% of people who can't afford to take that sort of money. And, if you're going to, it's great having the LA in charge of stuff, but you need, rather than relying on the occasional firework, like in Preston, I know, where they've had a lot of praise for the way that they've layered up the local authority structure. They use a lot of local contractors. They deliberately tender in such a way to bring and keep that value into the area, rather than let's outsource it for the cheapest possible price to wherever, which doesn't bring any of that prosperity. It's a very clever, very, very clever model. And of course, the LAs in the UK have got limited power to benefit from bringing that money back in to their own systems, which is another problem. But if you pay peanuts, guys, please don't complain to me when you turn around and you get monkeys. Look at what people can earn in the private sector, and you might get the odd Geoffrey Cox who can pull off £1 million a year job while he's an MP, but again, that's still going to come down to personality type, because he sure as hell doesn't do that for the money. So do you want people who want to be, and a lot of this has been mentioned throughout COVID, do you want people who want to move the little soldiers around the board because they're the general controlling everything? Or do you want people who are able to make a genuine career out of it and want to make a difference? Because you hear both about MPs at different times, and you get a pandemic style situation and you see just how much. I remember in February 2020 saying, there won't be any of these lockdowns over here. They wouldn't dare try that to us, and how misguided I was at that point. Not that I'm pro or anti lockdown, just to be clear, if anybody's looking for me to take a position on that. Depends what day it is.
Well, I find stuff like this really very interesting, because I made a comment on a LinkedIn thread recently where it said, can anyone believe that the government have done this, this, and this? And my simple comment was, how are you surprised? How are you shocked by any of this? Like, if you don't look at this government, let's go back the last 200 years and find me a government where they haven't been self-serving, lying, doing what they want, power. Like, you put these people in this position because they can handle, or they're supposed to be able to handle, the stress and pressures of it.
Who's that?
We've got new theme music. I like it. Is it commercial? Are we doing commercial breaks now?
Yeah.
Cheers. Sponsorship.
The reality of the situation that you point out there, Adam, is that that they're not paid as much as other governments around the world, and some people may say that those governments are somewhat a little bit more financially corrupt than others, or lack due process and things like that. And there's a myriad of different ways that you can kind of present that information. But one of the things I always kind of fall back on is a lady I know. She has worked pretty much her entire life. She's in her mid to late 60s, just the loveliest person. She is now a magistrate, which is you do it because you care, not because you get anything out of it. But if you think about, I think she can claim back the cost of her parking or a bit of petrol or something like that. It's completely unpaid. It's a volunteer job. And basically it's the first kind of tier of justice and things like that before it goes into criminal court and things like that. It's a role that requires so much responsibility on the person. And I think there is an element of, you pay someone for the skill that they have to employ. You pay somebody for the time it takes. You pay someone for the risk. So there's a lot of jobs out there that are paid really very well, not because they're highly skilled jobs, but because they're very, very risky jobs.
Yep.
Maybe you pay someone for the fact that the level of responsibility that they have to take on is far more than what anyone else. So I would imagine someone who is a heart surgeon gets paid more than someone who takes blood, because the responsibility and the risk and the skill amount to something that requires a little bit more. Because if you take on the stresses of how you implement that skill, how you manage the risk, and how you manage the reputation, how you manage the responsibility, those are highly stressful situations, and not everybody, I think, wants to take on highly stressful situations. In fact, there's probably a whole group of individuals who actively seek to remove themselves from situations where they have to take on massive amounts of responsibility, and stress. There's a whole group of people who take on stress extremely very well, but then later on in life suffer drastically from anxiety, from panic attacks and things like that. There has to be a recompense for the reactionary, consequence of the skill or art that you employ.
Just as the brain injuries of the professional footballers from heading the leather ball in the last couple of generations, the future of a Margaret Thatcher or whatever is I see that as a basically equivalent thing. The amount of stress and certain personality types are wired towards wanting to get towards the top jobs and all the rest of it. And our current bozo being somewhat Teflon has got him as far as he's gone so far. But ultimately, then when it's a very fragile line to cross. And of course, he'll still be the world's greatest after dinner speaker, even if he does go. So it's not going to be a complete disaster. I'm sure he'll still get a few quid. But it's very, if you think about, you talk about the risk, the murder rate of MPs, not in the last sort of 5. I mean, I'm obviously thinking of the recent ones that are in the mind, but you go back the last 40 years, and there's a higher murder rate for MPs than a hell of a lot of other professions. So it's there's an element of danger money in there. There's an element of that as well. But I'll try and segue us back via a thin veil of leveling up or similar to the theoretical core topic of the week. One of the other things that I commented on, that again, of course, I got vilified for, but unfortunately it's fact, and you can't really disagree with fact, is ultimately, in about 60% of the UK, a household with 2 people in, and this is not going to limit people to people who want to couple up or whatever, it could be you and a friend, it could be whatever. Household with 2 people in who both work full-time on minimum wage, can afford to buy a property and can afford to save a deposit in an abnormally low amount of time. We've got a property at the moment. We get a lot of inquiries from our tenants as to whether they can buy the house that they're in, and that's great. And we love to try and achieve that. And I'm sorry to say, so far we've only ever achieved it once, which is sad. Even though we've tried implementing rent to buy schemes and all that sort of stuff, we're not closing those sales, if you want. Not that we really want to, but we want to give people the opportunity. And we look like we're close to another one at the moment. And they're buying the house of us for 95,000 quid. It's been fully refurbished. It's had a best part of a 30 grand refurbishment. It's lovely. It's beautiful. And of course, I'm really pleased that we're going to sell it to them at the price we're going to sell it to them. I've got another tenant at the moment who they've been renting it for 7 years. Came over from Portugal, female engineer who works for Jaguar Land Rover. So she's extremely rare commodity, lovely family. And they're going to buy the house that they rented off me for those 7 years. And I'm delighted to, and again, an unpopular shelter style outcome, absolutely delighted to sell it to them. Going to get whacked for capital gains tax when it happens, not going to cry about it, get on with it, move on to the next one, realistically. Job done, great job. And they've got the safety and security they want. And they've also faced the reality that because it doesn't yield very well, that particular one, because it's in Solihull, because it doesn't yield very well, they're actually not going to be saving a lot of money every month, even with these incredibly low mortgage rates, because they'll have capital to pay back and all the rest of it. And then they said, well, what happens when the boiler breaks? I'm like, you're going to have to fix it for yourself this time. But if you need any help, we've got people locally. So, don't be a stranger sort of thing, So it's unfortunate that, in the majority of the UK, it is still extremely affordable with minimal sacrifice to buy a house. And okay, if you can't live next, it comes back to that arrangement. If you can't live next door to work, but you work in the city, well, get over it, quite frankly.
I think an hour's commute to work isn't unreasonable. There's been a couple of roles where I've commuted an hour, and I would read on the train or on the bus or whatever I was doing. You'd make use of the time. I don't think that's a problem. What I think is that there is I think people just believe that they're entitled. But no, I've always lived in this borough or this part of the world, so I should be able to afford to live here. Well, you can't.
Yep. And
you're not the only one.
if you were born in the UK, think yourself lucky because you already won the lottery of life in the first place. I mean, you know, it's a bit, again, it's not, I'm going to mention Molly May again. I'm not going full Molly May, but, you know, I absolutely see where I was super lucky, and there's points in my life where I've been super lucky. And I think we could probably all say the same. I can also point out the bits you don't want to hear about 100-hour work weeks and sacrifices and all the rest of it that don't go down particularly well. So I don't sit anywhere on that debate, because we've also all met the people who have come through horrific experiences in their childhood, been born in other countries, and are utterly inspirational. I remember interviewing a guy a few months back for an awards thing who was from Sri Lanka, had been born with nothing, had come to the UK, and the charity work that he was doing from a little business, he did not have any kind of big hub to do all of this from, just put me to utter shame. And I just thought, you're an incredible individual. And I told him that, and, you know, sent him in a few different directions. And bloody, I'm not supposed to say this, but I don't suppose anyone's watching, and definitely gave him the bloody award as well, because he deserves it more than anyone I've ever met, any award of anyone that I've ever seen. And so, you know, unfortunately, those things can happen. That's why I like the, you know, you make your own luck as long as you can avoid bad luck. You know, that is reality. But also be accountable, and don't say, it's when you say, I can't because the system's stopping me, the this, the that, the other. It's like, I'm sorry, but it's 5 whys to get rid of the I can't, because it isn't I can't, it's I don't want to. Yeah. And that's the savage reality of it, I think.
I think that's I mean, I can say, like, as a immigrant, I guess, a person who just came from like a different country, like, and need to start from scratch. It's just like you just get to do things that you need to do to make whatever you need to make, and then you slowly progress. But it is like you build things from scratch, and I think like that entitlement is the dangerous thing, because it gets us stuck in one kind of mode of thinking, and it doesn't allow for the creativity that you need to like make things work. And I think what's like Undercover Billionaire is also fantastic. It's a fantastic program that just kind of shows that it's like everyone, no matter like where you come from, can go through those like stressful situations where you think, like, how I'm gonna pay for my accommodation, how I'm gonna make this, how can I meet this person is so much above me.
Well, he was willing to sleep in the truck, he was willing to comb through the scrapyards to find the tires, he was of course he's armed with knowledge, and he's a pretty incredible character, but he still had to do that stuff as a billionaire. He still had to do that stuff to make that work, and that's that tells you the fire that you need, doesn't it?
Even in a situation where you know what to do, but it's like it's actually doing it that is so doing it while you know, like, it's beneath you, or kind of beneath what you've done in the past, or maybe beneath what your expectation what you should be doing is. And that's the kind of real thing, because
that's a really good example, because you see at the moment we're crumbling in the face of weak leaders in our society. You know, Bozo being the ultimate on that front, realistically. And we all know the stories about the CEO who, you know, speaks to the cleaner on the way in and knows their name and how many kids they've got and all the rest of it. And, you know, that to me, that is the personification of true leadership, authentic leadership, that propels you to the top of an organization, rather than, and I remember I certainly had a lesson like that once in life, where I thought I'd moved on, and I've had a few of these lessons over the years where I thought I'd moved on from something, and then I had to go back and do it exactly what I was doing several years before. And there's a bit in I won't give the exact quote, but there's a bit in I think it's in Pulp Fiction, where he says Marcellus Wallace, I think he's talking to Bruce Bruce Willis's character, and he said, you know, that feeling, something about getting punched in the face, and he said, that's pride. That's because he's talking about him taking a dive in the fight. He said, that's pride screwing with you. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. I felt that feeling, and it didn't do me any harm at the times when I felt it. As you know, I've been broke, I've been in debt, I've been in bad places, you know, mentally, financially, all the rest of it. And I'm not saying that, again, there's no violins, and I'm a hell of a lot better off than 99% of people in the world who weren't born in the UK. But ultimately, I could have gone down different paths when all of those things happen, and I haven't. And
there's a different appreciation as well for when you've done that and you've worked your way up. Like even when I was on the trading floor at JP, the first thing we did was we got sent to back office for a few weeks, and actually different kind of departments to understand how the mechanics, how the operations work. And actually you got a huge appreciation for the work and the way these people oiled the system. You also worked out, which really, if you were clever about this, and I was, that if you befriended those people and you were really nice to them, when the hit the fan or you messed up, they could get you out of it if they liked you. And guess what? Two of those people are my best friends to this day. And yes, I happen to like them as person. It wasn't a purely mercenary move. But, when things went wrong, you traded the wrong way round, you got a big figure wrong, I don't know, whatever it was, you pick it up like, dude, I've messed up. Can you help me out on this? Nothing dodgy, but they escalated that to the top of the pile and sorted that out before something else. And, that's what understanding and having that empathy for where those people are and what that job is like can pay dividends.
But this is the never forget where you came from, isn't it? This is absolutely that.
I made an argument a while ago with a previous employer, and they basically glorified the sales staff, and the admin were just fulfilling a function, right? Wow. And because the sales they perceived, as long as the sales could cover the cost of their seat, the sales brought the profit. But half the salespeople they could all speak English, but they could barely read and write. I mean, we're talking Neanderthals that could perform a function, but could do nothing beyond that. Could barely wipe their own ass. Could barely send an email without spelling their name incorrectly. Like I'm talking, but like apart from that, like charismatic, understood their craft. But hyper focused in a single direction. Could do nothing else. If it wasn't for the bank of administrators, or what they're now called sales support, without those in the background, there was no business to speak of.
Yes.
They couldn't create their own appointments. They couldn't diarise anything. They couldn't write up their own property.
Couldn't organise the way out of a paper bag, realistically.
It was brutal. And I kept saying, you need to, you can't pay the admin staff as much as you pay the sales, because the sales they're generating income. It's a completely different thing. But if you're going to create a system where every salesperson has 2 dedicated admins, then the success of the salesperson has to be reflected with how well that admin person is doing for them. So the admin person gets a bonus. Okay, it's not on the same level, but the admin person knows, right, the better I support my salesperson, the better I'm going to financially do.
Yeah, exactly.
And I know it's a little bit out of where we're saying, but you need to be able to do stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen agencies where people have retired after many years in the trade, and people swoop in and they go, "Oh, I'll get that salesperson who used to work for them." And it's like, no. The rainmaker's gone, right? And the people below him or her were bloody lucky to work underneath him or her, realistically. But the people who supported on the admin side, who made everything run, they're sort of left behind and forgotten about. And they're actually the people that you want to try and pick up, because they're I worked for him for 17 years. They're loyal. They're super competent. They know how he'll, they even know, they know the names, they know the contacts, they know there's so much richness in what they've got. And that's just typical of, thinking that, it's like the forward scores all the goals, but actually, is it the team that get the result at the end of the day? Of course it is, because and it goes back to also, if you don't like him, you won't pass the ball to them, and there's been plenty of that in the years over professional football as well. So you have to be quite cautious, don't you? But yeah, it is a touch off piece, but I like the analogy of when we in the intro, Jay, you talked about affordability a little bit, and it is a really interesting thing, because you might have seen that line that sort of divides the sort of true economic north and south, which kind of goes through Bristol and Leicester. So it kind of, it's almost, it's not quite 45 degrees, but it segments itself on the way up the country and talks about incomes. And that's where you come into sort of leveling up and things like that. I'm quite excited to be doing a few things in a few places in that northern quadrant at the moment, all of which have got quite good roadmaps for infrastructure development, individual projects that are going to take off, And I've said before, one thing I do like about the Johnson regime is that they will invest on the infrastructure side of things. I just think they're not seeing, and they should do, they're not seeing the people infrastructure as they should see the physical, because transport infrastructure is easier to understand, isn't it? Build a bridge, ideally for Boris, put his name on it, build this road, do this, do that, do the other. That's easy. But people, it's harder to see, but that's exactly what needs to go. And that's what the free ports and things like that need to be leveraged towards. And that's where we need to go. And a little bit of the supplement today, I was talking about the Finnish education system, which I have a particular bee in my bonnet about. But the actual gap between what they spend and the results that they get when you, like I am, boring and methodically get down to the data side of it, the reward for doing what they do. And I don't just mean sort of financial reward, although there obviously is a significant one, but the societal capital reward in what they do is off the bloody charts. And, it's not one of these left or right arguments. If you like it so much, why don't you effing move there yourself or whatever? I'm perfectly happy doing what I'm doing in this country. And the reality is I can afford the private stuff when the public stuff lets me down, much as that might also upset some people. But that is the truth of it. So you can live anywhere you want in the world. You can live apart from... So you can live in Monaco, apart from the fact it's one of the most boring places in the world. And you've got to find some other way to get your kicks, realistically, if you do.
Brilliant. Well, I think we had some comments. Obviously, we had comments from Dominic, our biggest fan of the show. So it's like we should add an advert before the show. This show is sponsored by Dominic Ormond. No, great comments, Dominic. Thank you for interacting with us. And basically, it was all about the density of population, 5.5K, 8 most in Portsmouth.
Did not know that.
Neither did I. That is incredible, isn't it? That is incredible.
Portsmouth is massively crowded, and people find it super difficult to obviously park there and stuff. And it's obviously there's no space to grow because it's an island or like semi-island or like it's quite it's like a UK in a nutshell. Okay.
Yeah.
In the UK, which cannot grow. But yeah, great comments, and had some comment from Raj. I can't remember what it was about.
I think that must be about Johnson as an after-dinner speaker. Will he be able to tell the difference between a work and I'm assuming that's what it is, and if it is, it's very, very funny indeed.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That was like the Jamie Carragher, Phil Neville chat that was that's gone viral over the weekend. Have you seen that? That's quite good stuff, really. Carragher played a blinder, to be honest.
Nice one. And again from Dominic, investment in brain infrastructure. That is another important infrastructure.
I think you come back a bit to sort of not necessarily entitlement, but where you came from and what you do to understand. I might have told this story before, but I was once on a coach when I was at. Have we mentioned my MBA yet today? No. When I was at Oxford University, I was once on a coach. We were playing rugby, and we were going up to my great old hometown, and to play a game. And one of the guys who I think he'd gone, Westminster, Eton, Charterhouse, Harrow, whatever the ridiculous educational CV, total cookie cutter, what you would expect of a public school boy. Couldn't get any more stereotypes in there if you tried. Even down to the sort of inbreeding of the upper classes look about the face, the whole 9 yards, right? And we got to with him, I think. we got to the M42 and where the M42 meets the M6, and he saw a block of flats and he said, "Oh, what's that there? What is that?" And we were like, "What do you mean? Sorry, what do you mean?" Like, because you wouldn't think he could possibly be talking about a block of flats, like looking for things like signage or a sheep somewhere or something. No, he was talking about a block of. He'd never seen a high-rise council-built block of flats before, and we were like, "That's a block of flats." And he was like, "Well, who lives there?" And it's like, from your perspective, mate, poor people. That's all you need to know, And that's the. So if that then led to furthering on and ending up in Whitehall or whatever, you can understand why they can't see the point of view of all of this stuff, and you can understand why. You know, the biggest problem I think that I have with the current administration is the way that they look down on the common man and woman, and I really feel there must, because you can see there's a rotten culture in there. You know, the culture thinks it's okay. I don't think Allegra Stratton should have been hanged for what she did in that video, because I think it was probably quite unfair. But the culture around it that empowers you to think that stuff is funny, that's a problem. You know, I understand. We all know people who are in the medical profession and they have their own breed of humour that gets them through. You know, it's very dark. It's very, there are psychological reasons why you need to do that stuff. But there's also an element of, it's back to that leadership breakdown, that it's not there. And it empowers people to, and then when you nip off to the co-op to get the wine in a suitcase or whatever, I mean, it's just, you couldn't really make it up. It's just making a mockery of the greatest institutions in our land. Yeah. And it's just a very, very sad thing to watch as we're on a, I mean, you know, Boris is now 67% likely to go this year, they say. I think he's not gone yet. You know, he's got alligator blood. No one knows how to turn it around like him. If it was Trump, I'd be worried he was going to start a war to distract everybody. If I'm honest, I don't think Boris is quite that self-serving and narcissistic. But something interesting will happen, and there'll be some. We just need to hope there'll be the right outcomes for the wrong reasons over the next few months, I think, to be honest.
Yeah. I had a similar experience, actually, like to your flat, Swan, introducing somebody, an ex-boyfriend again from Oxford, to Argos. It was this whole new revelation to him, and I just couldn't believe he'd never heard of it. Being in the shop, he's like, "How does this work?" He's like, "Where's the things on the shelves?" I'm like, "It's in the catalogue," and having to like talk him through the catalogue. Anyway, I digress.
I had the same thing when I first came from Poland. What is this thing?
Understandable. Kensington, Poland, you know, understandable.
As a 20-odd-year-old in London, like, you know, basically that's where all my like household stuff had come from. Even on investment banking beginner wages. This was a long time ago, remember? So
those are the days when they paid good money though as well. That was the thing, Helen. That was the thing.
Nice one. Okay, guys. Well, let's come back to the leadership things maybe next week, and let's expand on those things, the leadership maybe, and what we need in the world to create cultures that support good things, not bad things.
Sounds great.
Cool. Okay, brilliant. Well, if anyone else got some suggestions for our discussions, drop them in the comments and we'll try to respond to them today. And thanks for listening, and thank you for tuning in, guys.
And hit the subscribe button to Property Sisters YouTube, please.
Need the 2,000. Looking for the 2,000.
We're so close.
How many do we still need?
I think we need about 30 people. Please,
we'll make
all your friends and your mum and your cat and everybody.
Come on.
1.98k it says at the moment, Helen. There we go.
There we go.
Nice one. All right. Well, have a good Sunday, guys, and
enjoy.
Back next week, hopefully with Ross.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good week.
And almost done.